Next up, we're going to hear and have a conversation with Affinitiv, and we're going to talk about creating an effortless customer experience. I think the customer experience has definitely changed in the last few years, and so I'm excited to sit down and talk about how we can create an effortless customer experience. To help me do that, I'd like to welcome up Dean Martin. Dean, come on up. There you go, round of applause. Don't be stingy, don't be stingy. There we go. How are you, Dean?
How are you?
Good, welcome. Please, come on up. Glad to have you.
Sure.
All right. Oh, yes, clicker. I'm glad you reminded me. Thank you. Boom, there you are.
All right.
All right, so the customer experience has changed, obviously, over the last few years. How can we make it more effortless in today's world with what we're facing?
Absolutely. And one of the things that we're really seeing is a difference in customer communications and like the preferences of those in speed, right? And
Okay.
when we say speed, we're not always talking about like as fast as possible, because we're now in an age where like the immediate nature of these communications are happening on the fly, right? So we're talking to customers, it's coming quickly. Sometimes having a little bit of extra time allows the customers to make a more educating buying decision, right?
Yeah.
And just to give an example of that, like my daughter, sometimes when I try to call my daughter directly, it'll ring twice and go to voicemail. And
Right.
then she'll text me back and say, "What's up?" Right? So customer preferences in their communications is a big one. We're now also in the show me culture,
Okay.
meaning we can have a conversation with someone standing on our front porch and we're 1,000 miles away on vacation, right? And if you've been in an Uber or a Lyft, every interaction within that vehicle is captured at all times. So video and photo are critical for communicating with your customers. And really it comes down to removing a lot of that friction
Yeah.
out of each of these communications consistently. And now we live in what a lot of people recognize as the experience economy,
Okay.
right? And the experience economy, it's something that's grown in popularity over time. Some people are familiar with it, some people not so much. But it's really defining what those expectations are, and they're really greater than ever.
Yeah, and I think it's funny you mentioned your daughter. So first off, let me ask, how old is your daughter?
30.
30. Okay, so I have a 19-year-old. And it's funny that you mentioned that because it's that same way. So my daughter's the opposite. I text her and then I wait. Because for whatever reason, I don't know, and then she'll finally text back and I'll be like, oh, you're just now seeing your text, but you're always on your phone, right?
Yep.
So I get what you're saying. It's knowing who your audience is, who you're talking to, and how they're going to respond. And you not panicking or freaking out or jumping to take action, kind of like you said, sometimes slowing down
Exactly.
and giving them time to actually process or deal with the information or what it is you're presenting. So
Right.
what are some practical ways, because you mentioned video and the inundation of that and being important into our culture, what are some ways that we can do that in a practical sense that'll help us?
So when we talk about the experience economy, I think it's
Yes.
important to truly understand like the origin and where that sort of came from. And it really looks at the overall perception of market value and customer need, right? So when you look at the market value of something over time, and then the customer need goes from generic to very specific.
Right.
And I like to use the kind of the explanation, the example of something as simple as coffee, because we're all familiar with coffee, right? And when coffee became popular in the 15th century, it was harvested, it was ground, and then created a beverage, and then people would kind of gather to enjoy this energizing beverage. And over time, that turned into the coffee houses of Europe, which then turned into the coffee houses in America, where you would have intellectuals like Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, who would frequent these places and talk about philosophy and science and politics. But then you have, in 1971, you have a brand new concept on the cobblestone streets of Seattle that we all know as Starbucks,
Right.
which created a brand new concept, right? This is a place where they invited their customers to come in and linger
Yeah.
and enjoy soft music and sit in really comfortable chairs, and they could order a plethora of different caffeinated beverages and teas from around the world, maybe some kind of breakfast item, right?
Right.
And so what Starbucks did was they created a distinct identity
Okay.
for what they did. And as dealers, we know this as your unique selling proposition, your brand promise that you're making to your customers. And so when you take that and you combine it with the repeatable experience, right, then you're repeating that experience for not only that customer that comes to see you consistently, but you're also creating that repeated experience for all of your different locations.
Right.
And we all know Starbucks has done that incredibly well. Because
Absolutely.
you go to a Starbucks in Houston, or or even of course Seattle or Jacksonville, Florida, that experience is always the same. So they've done those things incredibly well. So as dealers, we have to ask, how seamless is your sales process for your customers? So if you have customers who are filling out all of their personal information online and then they show up in the showroom and they have to do that all over again, not an ideal experience, right? Same thing when we talk about your service scheduling process. Can your customers schedule within 2 minutes? And in that process, can they see their declined services that maybe they saw from their previous visit? And can they see offers and discounts and coupons which would apply to that, right? And then you look at your service check-in process. It's the same thing. Like, you want the logjam every single day. I know a lot of dealers can't avoid that, but there's technology that can help with that process.
I agree, and I think a lot of what you mentioned is imperative, because even with the customer experience, talking about that customer that fills out everything online and then comes in, the idea of being able to fill it online is almost like a warm transfer, right? Like,
Yeah,
I should be able to come fill it out online, and by the time I get to the dealership, it's, oh, hey, Steve, how are you? Welcome, good to see you. We start, but instead, sometimes it is, oh, you did what? You filled out. And that automatically makes, as a customer, I would feel like, well, where did all my information go that I pulled up? And same thing, obviously, with service, right? Bringing our cars in for service is already something that we don't want to do, So when I do bring it in, I want to have that warm feeling where somebody, like you said, is expecting me, or I know what to expect. I have an expectation before I arrive.
Right.
So I think what you're talking about is great. The other thing you brought to mind when you mentioned Starbucks, the importance of being able to adapt and grow. It's funny, when you mentioned Starbucks, I thought about Folgers. You remember Folgers in the commercials?
Yep.
What happened to them? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if they still exist, so no disrespect to Folgers at all, but I just was thinking about it, like, they had a whole jingle, best part of waking up, all that stuff. But now the culture is everyone is waking up and going to a location or on their way to pick up their coffee.
Yep.
So being able to adapt what you're doing in your customer experience, especially because obviously we've come out of the pandemic. People were doing a lot of shopping online because they couldn't, service departments were the only thing that were open in some cases. So now we're seeing that experience change and emerge. You mentioned technology earlier. How is some of the emerging technology impacting this customer experience that we're seeing as a whole?
Yeah, and I want to kind of go through the 4 pillars and how that applies to technology, and really walk through, each of these and kind of touch on some of the technology. And the first is really channel stickiness. We talked about that as being able to communicate to your customers at the channels that they're most familiar with and they're most likely to respond to. And that's always going to vary. In fact, sometimes there's a slight advantage to having a little bit of time between the time that let's say you tell somebody that they have a $2,800 transmission repair. If you tell them that on the phone, automatically they're thinking, I can't afford that. How do I do that? And the reason for that a lot of times is because that information goes through, the primitive part of the brain first,
Right.
and then it, hits the amygdala, which is their, fight or flight response, and they think, I can't do that, I can't afford it, I can't do it. So sometimes just having a little bit of time there for like cooler heads to prevail, and it goes to the neocortex part of the brain, and they think, okay, well, I got to get this done, right? I have to have a vehicle.
Yeah.
So, and then another one is next issue avoidance. And that's specifically looking at some of the areas where you can get ahead of the customer that is absolutely going to need a loaner every time they come in, right? And it could also be a next issue, but could be an opportunity where you have a customer coming in for service and they are able to see an opportunity for a new vehicle that they could purchase, because now you've got equity mining technology that can point to that and say, hey, you're paying $790 a month currently. There's an offer where you could pay, $620 or something, right? And then we look at experience engineering and creating effortless interactions and really providing them clear instructions, right? And that really comes down to giving them photos, providing the evidence of what they've found during an inspection, right? Really having the technician walk around and say, Mr. Johnson, this is what we found, here's what we recommend, and being able to show that to them, is like a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, a video's worth 1,000,000 words, right? If you truly think about it. And then frontline control, making sure that the dealership staff is equipped with the information to know exactly how to engage those customers the right way, and then going through and making those decisions that reduce the customer effort.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. And so in looking at imploring some of these 4 pillars, and specifically the experience engineering, one of the things you mentioned that was really intriguing is I never thought about it, but just from a service standpoint, it's one thing to say, hey, we found a leak or a cracked hose or whatever the case might be, but then showing someone that I've never had that experience where I just kind of have to blindly trust that whatever the report that I get is what it is. So how, if I'm a dealer and somebody's thinking out there like I am, how can I practically implement some of these 4 pillars in a way that's going to give me that traction or reaction that I'm looking for?
Sure. And I will say, historically, on the sales side of the dealership, they were ahead of the curve, because a lot of times they would, if you're interested in a vehicle, I'm your salesperson. I can walk out to the lot and actually do a walk around. I can show you the features in the vehicle before you show up to the lot, right? I know you're interested. We know the success of that. And now with that technology, with technicians and service advisors being able to leverage the same thing, it creates trust and transparency, so that not only are you able to show them what your recommendations are and you're providing the evidence, but you're teaching them something. And when you teach someone something, there's chemicals that kind of change your brain, where you're in active learning. And if they're, kind of learning how something works, they're more likely to trust you further.
Absolutely. And then it allows them to ask questions that they may have or want to know, because sometimes you don't know the questions to ask, especially if you're not the technician or you haven't worked on your vehicle, especially the way the vehicles are set up today. So what will we move to next? So after we work towards using the technology that we have at our disposal, and then identifying the channel, like you mentioned, that's a very important thing. Like, how am I going to communicate this? What would be the next step after I've kind of worked to get these pillars in place?
Sure. The best things to keep in mind moving forward is, number one, you really have to think about the frequency of the experience. You're going to have your customers for service in a few times a year. You might have some warranty work or recalls. So you're seeing them way more often than when they make that new vehicle purchase.
Right.
So you're looking at every 5 to 7 years for that new vehicle purchase. So if you really think about it, they're voting for the new president more often than they're coming in for the new vehicle.
Yeah.
Right? So it makes it that much more important for that experience to be an absolute home run every time, because as we know, this sales experience defines how likely they are to come to you for service.
Right.
Because if that's the culture they're used to with your sales staff, then they'll expect that with your service staff as well. And you really got to think about what the product is you're delivering, right? If you get a vehicle in that they're coming in to replace a starter, right? You have the cost of the starter, you have the labor, you have the shop fees, you have all of the things associated with that service. But what you're really providing is, like shown here, you're providing the peace of mind for maybe a single mom to go out every morning and her vehicle is going to start so she can get her kids to school and get to her Pilates class and, of course, get to Starbucks, right?
Right.
You got to throw Starbucks in there. And then hyper personalizing the experience, right? And part of that could be using like what we call pizza trackers, right? Knowing every step of the process for service. So when you arrive in the service lane, the status of the vehicle, all the way up until they cash out. That's a big factor. And then one of the big things I like to focus on is, as dealers, we think about selling cars and writing service and driving revenue with the dealership. But really, the role is being the trusted advisor to your customers, right? And allowing them to be able to make an educated buying decision. Because that's what it comes down to, right?
Right.
They need to be secure in the make, model, vehicle trim level that you're recommending to them, but also the services that you're recommending. So being the trusted advisor allows you to really, show them exactly how you are the trusted advisor, and then, then they'll trust you over the long term.
Yeah, and I think a couple of great points that you mentioned is specifically about how your experience in sales can help determine you're coming back for service. But I think the other side of that too is that experience in service can also determine if they're going to come back for another sales opportunity.
Yep.
I've seen a lot of times when you talk to dealers, and even from a customer standpoint, there's a pride that comes in saying, well, I bought it here and all my service has been done here. Like people make a point in an effort to say that when they've gotten their service done at the dealership that they purchased it from, as almost as if like this is a selling point. Like all my service has been done here. You don't have to guess. They've done everything.
Right.
And that it creates that relationship and that trust. So I think to your point, it's important to have these pillars in place so that way the sales supports the service, but also service supports the sales.
Absolutely.
And that cycle just continues.
Yeah, and there's an interesting study that we performed at Affinitiv last year on that specifically, where we looked at customers who purchase vehicles at a dealership. When they rated that experience as an excellent experience versus just an average experience, those customers were 3 times more likely to repurchase from that dealership, right? And likewise, the same holds true for the brand or OEM, right?
Yes.
They're twice as likely to repurchase from that same OEM.
That makes sense. That's
yeah.
great. Now, we've got about a minute left. Dean, anything that you want to share, like any other great information nuggets or things that if people want to contact you to find out more about implementing these pillars, how can they do that?
Sure. So I would just invite everybody to come by the Affinitiv booth at 226, so we're way on the other end. And our mission here at NADA is really elevating that dealership experience. And we say that because our focus is making life simpler for dealership staff, of course, and elevating the experience for the staff, but also elevating the experience for the customers they serve.
That's great. I love that. And the good thing is, even if they're trying to get to the other side, you've seen the golf carts. Just hop on a golf cart and get over there. There's no excuse. We make it easy for you, right? So, Dean, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for telling us about the 4 pillars and all the things to help make that customer experience effortless. I really appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thank you
so much.
Glad to be here.
Appreciate you joining us.